the world of literature, nearly everyone has heard of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, or perhaps The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. I'm here to tell you that the book Kolyma Tales by Varlam Shalamov far outshines any of these books and is quite possibly one of the best books I've ever written in my life. However, you've probably never heard of it. Few works of literature confront the limits of human endurance as starkly as this book. Written out of nearly 2 decades of survival in the Soviet Gulag, these stories are not testimonies of redemption or faith, but of destruction, indifference, and the stripping away of the human soul. Whereas other authors like Solzhenitsyn, writing about the Gulag, saw moral meaning in the suffering, Shalamov saw only annihilation. His writing, sparse and uncompromising, captures both the brutal philosophy of the camps and the often oddly haunting beautiful of the indifferent northern landscape of eastern Siberia. In Kolyma Tales, hunger becomes passion, bread becomes more important than love, and friendship is tested to the breaking point. Nature itself emerges as both the enemy and silent witness to the brutality that happens in the camps. What makes the book unforgettable is not only its honesty, but its beauty, its vision of life and death, unfiltered by ideology and told by a man who is not merely an observer, but a participant. To read Shalamov's Kolyma Tales is to encounter a philosophy of survival, where suffering has no lesson, morality often bends before force and power, and yet, against all odds, memory and humanity persist. The book depicts life in the Gulag, and what distinguishes it from other well-known works, such as by Solzhenitsyn, is its gritty realism. Solzhenitsyn, deeply religious, often attributed spiritual meaning to the suffering he witnessed. There is even a famous quote where he explains Russia's suffering as punishment for losing faith under state-enforced atheism. Every story of his ties back to meaning, almost viewing the suffering as a form of penance. Shalamov, on the other hand, is the opposite. At one point, he writes that convicts felt spiritual freedom precisely because their sins had already been redeemed in the endless years in the camps. Shalamov was a staunch atheist and refused to attach moral meaning to the suffering he endured. A common theme throughout Kolyma Tales is that suffering destroys rather than redeems. In contrast to many novels, philosophies, or religious interpretations, Shalamov constantly reinforces the idea that suffering brings no lessons, no enlightenment, only indifference and destruction. And if you disagree, he felt that you had not truly suffered. The indifference echoes in his reference to Anatole France's short story about Pontius Pilate, who, when asked about Jesus of Nazareth, does not even remember him. In the camps, convicts never forget their suffering or the brutal administrators who presided over their lives. The same administrators who arbitrated over their sentences often forgot the decisions they had made. Decisions that caused permanent scars and lifelong trauma were oftentimes no more than 5-second decisions that were quickly forgotten by lunch. These officials were not necessarily monstrous. Many were simply bureaucrats and apparatchiks making arbitrary choices. Their forgetfulness were perhaps more chilling than cruelty itself. Shalamov even disputed Solzhenitsyn's own account of his experience in the Gulag, remarking sarcastically about a story in which Solzhenitsyn mentioned owning a cat. Shalamov pointed out that in the real Gulag, there was no concept of cats as pets. It would have been eaten long ago. Even Solzhenitsyn admitted that Shalamov's experiences were harsher and more bitter than his own. It's strange, but in a weird way, Kolyma Tales is hauntingly beautiful to me. I like to compare it to Dark Souls, a video game unique because it doesn't try to justify itself to the player, just like this book doesn't try to justify itself to the reader. It makes absolutely no attempt to persuade or promote an ideology. It simply states, in a matter-of-fact way, what happened in the camps. Its authenticity is what makes it so powerful, and its indifference is a testament to how the author saw the book as less of a political or ideological testimony, but simply a tribute to the memory of those who suffered in the camps. The imagery itself that he makes is unforgettable. He describes the essential purity of the unforgiving Kolyma landscape. Despite all the suffering, the land itself remains innocent and indifferent. Snow covers the bodies each winter, pure white, while spring always returns, no matter how terrible the winter, bringing furious blooms of flower and berries. Each plant and animal fights desperately for life. He writes how the permafrost retreats each year in the spring, only to be quickly followed by roots seeking every inch of freed soil. Everything in eastern Siberia fights for life, and in a weird way, it makes them value it that much more than those who are from the mainland, or as they like to call it, the world that they had left behind. I haven't felt such a strong promotion of life since reading Jack London and White Fang. It so beautifully describes the desperate fight for life that occurs in the natural world every second. And he writes poetically of the trees, whose wood is useless for fire construction, noting that, in a sense, the trees exact revenge for their own difficult lives in the northern taiga. And one striking metaphor compares writers and readers to the convicts trampling snow to create paths. Writers, like those trampling, perform the exhausting work, while readers simply travel along the roads afterwards. This observation reminds me of something my roommate once said, that most people consume, but very few create. Shalamov in this passage describes writers, the true creators, as the ones that the state feared the most, individuals with personalities and souls who would question the regime and potentially be a threat. Shalamov also connects man and nature, noting in one quote that there's only 3 weeks of cold, hunger, and beatings that separate man from beast. His philosophy also mirrors that of other books that emphasize power over morality. Examples that are similar include in Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book, the concept known as Law of the Jungle, the harsh realism depicted in the Melian dialogue, where the quote, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must come from, and finally Jack London's Law of Club and Fang. Shalamov writes this quote, "In any discussion, the main argument is a fist or stick. An intellectual turns into a coward, and his own brain suggests a justification for his actions. He can persuade himself of anything. He can take any side in an argument. A slap, a punch, is enough to turn an intellectual into an obedient servant of some thieving senya or kostya. Physical influence becomes moral influence. The intellectual becomes a permanently scarred creature. His spirit is broken. Even when he gets back to life, to freedom, he will still have this intimidated and broken spirit. The strong determined what is right, and in the Gulag, a man's worth was measured by his ability to fulfill quotas." He also writes in another quote, "We learned another amazing thing. In the eyes of the state and its representative, a physically strong person was better, yes, better, more moral, more valuable than a weak person who couldn't shovel 20 cubic meters of dirt out of a trench in a day. The former was more moral than the latter. He fulfilled his quota, that is, carried out his chief duty to the state and society, and was therefore respected by all. His advice was asked, and his desires were taken into consideration, and he was invited to meetings whose topics were far removed from shoveling heavy, slippery dirt from wet and slimy ditches." This reminded me of my time in the army, where physical ability, badges, and credentials determined credibility and respect. Those who were strongest or most decorated often made decisions about logistics, morality, or long-term planning, areas far removed from physical endurance. In both the army and the Gulag, systems often elevated those least suited for leadership into those positions. And in the book, the convict's philosophy was stripped of traditional morality. For example, prisoners knew that warmth could be felt simply through a relative change in temperature. Negative 40 degrees rising to negative 30 degrees still felt warm for a week, and planning beyond a week was meaningless. They had long since forgotten to plan anything more than a week out. In one story, Shalamov writes about his skills to sneak into an easier job. His partner worries that they'll be caught. Shalamov replies, "Does it matter? At least it'll be warm for a few days, and what happens after that is irrelevant. For convicts, morality was measured in days, not lifetimes." And in one of my favorite passages, Shalamov's description of the taiga's origin showed that he still found time to appreciate the beauty around him. He goes, "I remember the old northern legend of how God created the taiga when he was still a child. There were few colors, but they were childishly fresh and vivid. Their subjects were simple. Later, when God grew up and became an adult, he learned to cut out complicated patterns from his pages and created many bright birds. God grew bored with his former child's world, and he threw snow on his forced creation and went south forever. Thus went the legend." Scholars suggested this legend was Shalamov's intention, but I resist that interpretation. Oral traditions are easily lost, and absence of evidence does not prove absence of existence. My own experiences in the army showed me countless unwritten stories, never recorded, some deliberately silenced with the words, "We will never speak of this again." Just because we lack records doesn't mean events or legends never existed. Shalamov's life mirrored his work, tragic, stripped of redemption. Imprisoned as an enemy of the party, his soul was crushed. He admitted that women were never a significant part of his life because of his experience in the camps. After release, he descended into madness, dying alone in a nursing home. His work circulated only underground as samizdat, or the underground newspaper that resisted censorship in the Soviet Union. His funeral was attended only by his caretaker. Like the quiet, anticlimactic end of All Quiet on the Western Front, his death carried no fanfare. And as a result, even his writing style reflects his life. Unlike Solzhenitsyn's polished prose, Shalamov's is abrupt, blunt, and spare. At times, he ends stories mid-sentence, mirroring the exhaustion of camp life. His work reads less like crafted literature than survival notes, written not for art but for preservation. His ink on paper was his campfire, keeping memories alive before they were lost forever. He even has a few things to say about love, but not the romantic kind. His love centered around food. One reader described how Shalamov could inflict more emotion and passion about bread than most novels do about romance. Bread becomes radiant with meaning, transforming a prisoner's day. He wrote one time in his story, "Gliebov couldn't have said whether the bread tasted good or not. Taste was an entirely different thing, not worthy to be compared with the passionate sensation that made all else recede into oblivion." Reading this, I, as a well-fed man, could only give a sense of how much hunger the man had felt at that moment. In the Gulag, higher emotions froze away, leaving only hunger, bitterness, anger, and vengeance. Humanity itself thinned, just as the flesh melted from the convicts' bodies. Shalamov also rejected the idea that suffering creates bonds. The military popularly holds that brotherhood is forged through hardship, but Shalamov counters this by saying, "Friendship is not born in conditions of need or trouble. Literary tales tell of difficult conditions which are an essential element in forming any friendship, but such conditions are not simply difficult enough. If tragedy and need brought people together and gave birth to their friendship, then the need was not extreme and the tragedy not great." So in conclusion, this book, Kolyma Tales, I believe is a book about life. It's a book about philosophy. It's a book about humanity, although it doesn't try to be. I think you can get a lot of that out of this book because in one of the harder times in my life, this book actually helped me more than therapy or anything else. You see, after reading this book, I felt the suffering was so intense in the experiences shared by Shalamov that nothing that I'd faced in my entire life was comparable in the slightest. And I felt that if Shalamov could survive this experience, however horribly he did so, then I could survive mine as well.